Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. If you can start off by putting your name, your pronouns, the organization or city where you're at in the chat box, we can just get ready to go in just a few minutes. Welcome, everybody, to Bracing for the Wave, Mass Evictions in Communities of Color. We're excited to get ready to get into this report. We're going to give it one more minute before we get started. And if you can put your name, pronouns, organization, and city you're calling from in the chat box. Just so everyone knows, we're going to be recording the call and we'll be sharing it out as well as the report and other mentioned resources in a follow-up email right after this. All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the national webinar on Bracing for the Wave, Mass Evictions in Communities of Color, hosted by City Life Vida Urbana and Right to the City Alliance. I'm Kamal Walton. I'm Right to the City Senior Organizer for Communications, and I'll be moderating the press webinar today. And like I said, we'll be recording the call and sharing it out with everyone who registered, as well as the resources that are mentioned, including the report that's getting released today. So before we get started, I wanted to go over a couple of Zoom tech tips. So we want to make sure that people use the chat box. This is a webinar setup, so we won't be doing audio from everyone, but please definitely use the chat box as much as possible so that we can have a fruitful conversation with everyone, and you can send us as many questions as come up throughout the presentation. We'll have a pretty big chunk of time towards the end of the call for Q&A, and we have someone, Franji, with us who is trying to capture all of the questions that y'all have in the chat box. So the agenda for today, right now, we're welcoming, we're getting grounded, and next we'll talk about who we are and the purpose of the call. We'll give some national context, and then hear the report presentation from City Life Vida Urbana. This whole webinar is coming together because of the powerful work they've been doing, and we're going to hear from some of their organizers, from their partners at MIT, and some of their members about the importance of this report. And then we'll be hearing some perspectives and content from other member organizations across the country who are also facing intense threats of evictions and have been doing work around evictions for a long while. After that, we'll dig into the question and answer portion, and then we'll be able to get into next steps before we wrap up the call. So first, I want to get into why we're having this call. So the reason we're having this call is because national webinars, especially in the moment of COVID-19, are one of the ways that we can continue to build our movement. Over the past several years, including through Right to the City's Renter Nation training series, these calls have allowed us to center grassroots voices, experiences, and perspectives. These are opportunities for us to deepen our understanding and gain insights and feedback from other sectors of the work and the movement more broadly. Today's City Life Vida Urbana will be sharing their analysis, findings, and recommendations, and we'll be hearing from other folks on the front lines across the country about how this report relates to their work and what we're doing to respond to this threat. Right to the City Alliance is an alliance of over 85 organizations across the country working to transform the ways that we relate to and think about land and housing. Through our Homes for All campaign, and since March of 2020, through our Beyond Recovery campaign, which has been a response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the drastic impacts it's had on renters and low-income homeowners across the country. It's been crucial that we highlight the fact that many people across the country have been on the brink of eviction, foreclosure, or housing instability long before the pandemic struck. And a lot of these organizations have been doing work around all of these issues long before, and it's been even more intensified now. And so we're really trying to ring the alarm, not just based on this particular moment, but about the crisis as a whole that's been happening for many, many years. Member organizations like City Life Vida Urbana, Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative, Housing Justice League, and BASTA have been addressing these problems through a myriad of different work. We've seen powerful organizing secure eviction moratoriums and more housing security for people across the country in the face of the COVID pandemic. And we've also been bracing for the moment when those moratoriums and protections come to a close and what that means for our communities. So City Life has done a lot of work to uncover the impacts of eviction on communities of color that are hit the hardest, and we're excited to dig into those findings. And we also want to have a deeper conversation through hearing from member organizations and in the Q&A at the end of the presentation from organizers across the country who can help us think through what it looks like to fight back against eviction while building our power in communities across the country. So over 450 people have registered for this call today from over 35 different states across the country, including policy advocates, researchers, funders, directly impacted folks, grassroots groups and alliances, our allies, and so many more. We encourage everybody to share your thoughts in the chat, to send any questions, to send examples, to share your ideas, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the Q&A section, which is around like 40 minutes, so hopefully more juicy than it has been in other webinar-y spaces. And if you haven't yet, you can put your name, organization, and city in the chat box so we can all see who is on. And before we hear from City Life, I'm going to slide it over to Pam, who is also here at Right to the City Alliance, to give a little bit of national context around the conversations and work happening around evictions. And then we'll hear from City Life Vida Urbana.
Thanks, Kamau. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pam Fawn, and I'm a national field organizer at Right to the City Alliance based out of Portland, Oregon. And I'll be really brief so that y'all can get a chance to actually hear from organizers on the ground, but particularly have a really rich conversation that Kamau was talking about that we wanted to build in to this webinar. A few things to remember about this moment in time that we really want to be thinking about is that there was already a housing crisis, and COVID-19 makes it painfully clear that there are systemic failures to working people in the United States. And actually the system is operating exactly how it was designed to. 26 million people may face eviction across the country in the coming days, and some of those the eviction moratoriums have already sunsetted in certain places like Texas, Michigan. And 44% of Black tenants have stated that they had slight to no confidence that they would be able to make their next rent payment, with Black women in particular bearing the lion's share of the burdens to come. Federal actions have subsidized top real estate investors with tax breaks and have left low-income renters homeowners, and small landlords with mounting debt. If public officials refuse to heed these lessons of the last recession, today's public health crisis definitely will become a catastrophe of evictions and foreclosures for those who do the essential work of propping up our local and state economies. Folks may have heard today that new legislation was introduced federally to address this jigsaw of local and state protections to maintain housing stability. And there may be an opportunity to talk about that a little today. However, we're really excited to share the report. Although the question that we and our members do ask about these moratoriums is that we ask you to think about the root causes and understand that evictions themselves are a tool to maintain property and profit over the stability of health and people. So with that, I wanted to hand it back to Kamau to start us off.
Yeah, so I'm just going to hand it over to our folks at City Life Vida Urbana so they can get into the key findings of the report. And Samir, if you can start up the slides again on slide 5.
Awesome. Thank you, Kamau, and thank you, Pam. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lisa Owens. I'm the Executive Director of City Life Vida Urbana, and I'm so excited to welcome all of you to the launch of our Evictions in Boston report, which was produced by MIT researchers David Robinson and Justin Steele in collaboration with City Life. So City Life is a 47-year-old housing justice organization in Boston, and we fight for racial, economic, social, and gender justice by building working class power. We do this by organizing working class tenants and homeowners in the greater Boston area to fight displacement and forced moves and win community control over land and housing. During the COVID crisis, we also operate an emergency housing hotline in English and in Spanish for people who are in danger of losing their homes. So I'm going to mention the key findings of the report, and then I'm going to turn it over to David, who will go over the findings in greater detail. This report clearly shows that eviction filings and market rate rental housing are disproportionately occurring in Boston's communities of color, and particularly in Black communities. These trends are related to neighborhood poverty and income levels, but they are more closely correlated with the share of Black renters in a neighborhood than other socioeconomic characteristics. These findings take on an even greater significance during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we believe that the worst may be yet to come for our communities. The looming eviction crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic will likely disproportionately impact communities of color. And so now I'm going to turn it over to David so that he can explore these findings in greater detail. And you might want to advance the slide a couple of slides. I did the first 2.
Hello, I'm just waiting for the slide deck to, not the next slide, but the one after. But yeah, so Samir, if you could move forward to slide 2, I'm going to get started now. But basically, yeah, so my name is David Robinson. I'm a researcher at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. And I helped write this report with Justin Steele. He's an associate professor of law and urban planning at MIT and in partnership with City Life Vida Urbana. So before I get into kind of the key findings, there's a couple things I want to talk about just about the data and the methods to kind of ground us in that. So the first is that this data comes from 3 years of housing court records. And that's from Boston Housing Court from 2014 through 2016, which was the most recent publicly available data to us. And so, you know, what we, okay, it looks like the slides will be moving. Okay. What we, you know, what we really wanted to do is we wanted to understand a little bit more where evictions are happening and what are the main, you know, predictors of evictions. And so what we did in order to kind of create that data set was we took the address level eviction data and we merged it with census tract data that showed neighborhood characteristics, and also property level data that showed property characteristics. And so that gave us a really powerful tool to kind of answer that question of where are evictions happening, and what are the main predictors of evictions. And so we used a variety of kind of analysis techniques. We looked at maps. We looked at some kind of higher level statistics that I'll share. And then we also did some more powerful analytic regression tools to really understand what are the main predictors of evictions. I'm just pausing for the slide because a lot of the slide deck is visual, so I just want to make sure we have access to that. So if you could go to the, not this slide, but the one after when it's ready. Okay, great. So before I get started on kind of talking about some of the key findings, I want to kind of ground us in what our data set is and what it's missing. And so if you could see in this chart, what our data set captures is formal evictions. That means evictions that go to housing court. And what it doesn't capture is ways that evictions and displacement happen informally that are not captured in the data. And so, you know, I think it's important to just, when we're talking about some of these findings, not seeing it as the sum total of all evictions that are happening in Boston, but really kind of pulling out the trends and what are we learning about the patterns of these evictions. You can go to the next slide. So the key finding here is that market rate eviction filings in Boston are occurring disproportionately in neighborhoods of color, and particularly Black neighborhoods. So what we did is, you know, we mapped these eviction filings and found that 70% of them in market rate housing are occurring in neighborhoods of color. So those are communities where the majority of residents are people of color. And that's in compared to only about 50% of the rental units that are actually in those neighborhoods. And so that's a significant disparity. And then we also saw that in Black neighborhoods, and these are neighborhoods where the majority of residents identify as Black or African American, this disparity is exacerbated. So 37%, a little over a third of all market rate eviction filings are happening in majority Black neighborhoods, even though only about 18% of the rental housing stock in the city is in these neighborhoods. And so that's about 2 times more common than you would expect in Black neighborhoods if eviction filings were evenly distributed across the city. If you go to the next slide. So this is a map representing the highest eviction filing rates in market rate housing by neighborhood in Boston. And so what we can see is the neighborhoods with the highest market rate eviction filing rates are Roxbury, Mattapan, Hyde Park, South End, Lower Roxbury, and Dorchester, historically Black neighborhoods, and you know, neighborhoods with a large population of people of color. And the other thing I want to highlight from this map is that 2 neighborhoods in particular, East Boston and Chinatown, show up in our data as not having high rates of eviction in market rate housing. And this is really kind of contrary to the experience of housing organizers, legal aid lawyers who see a lot of evictions and displacement in these communities. And so it points to the potential that our data set may be undercounting evictions that don't actually go through courts, particularly in neighborhoods with large immigrant populations. If you go to the next slide. So these 2 sets of maps show the overlap really between the eviction filing rates and market rate housing and the racial composition of the neighborhoods. So in both of these maps, the base map, so the grayscale, the darker the gray, the higher concentration of renters of color on the left, and then on the right, the higher concentration of Black renters. And then the bubbles, the orange bubbles, the larger the bubble, the higher the eviction filing rate in market rate housing. And so what these maps really demonstrate quite clearly is that there's a real correlation between the the eviction filing rate, the likelihood of evictions in market rate housing, and the share of renters of color. And then in particularly, you can see how concentrated eviction filings are in neighborhoods where there's a large share of Black renters. And so what we saw these patterns and we wanted to kind of dig into them a little deeper. And so we did some regression analysis looking at the likelihood of an eviction filing to occur in any given market rate property. And we found that above and beyond indicators like median household income, the percent of households that are facing rent burden, the poverty rate, socioeconomic indicators, that we are seeing that the share of renters, the share of Black renters in a neighborhood is one of the most significant predictors of eviction filings in market rate housing. And Lisa can talk a little bit more about kind of the context for that in a few minutes. But if you could go to the next slide. And then another thing we did, when we started this research, as Kamau and Pam have kind of pointed out, there was a housing crisis occurring in communities of color in particular. But now we're in a different situation where many more households, many more families have lost employment and are facing really severe housing instability. And so we wanted to take a look and just see how this data from 2014 through 2016, what that looked like in today's data. And so what we did is we pulled eviction records from when the pandemic first hit Boston in March 1st to April 20th, when the eviction moratorium in Massachusetts was signed by the governor. And we found that 78% of these evictions that were filed occurred in communities of color. And what this really highlights for us is that this has been an issue, but in the coming months, when there's a real surge of evictions, if there's not kind of policy in place to block that, these surge of evictions are going to disproportionately impact communities of color in similar ways that they have been doing. If you go to the next slide. And the last thing I want to talk about is, so we took a look at neighborhoods, which I've kind of shared with you, and some of the characteristics of neighborhoods. But we also wanted to take a look at some of the characteristics of market rate properties and their relationship with eviction filings. And so there are kind of three key findings here. The first is that we found that eviction filings are more likely in neighborhood or in properties where the landlord is absentee, as opposed to an owner-occupied landlord living in the unit. We also found that market rate eviction filings were more likely statistically if it was a newer building or the building was more recently renovated. And above and beyond that, if the property value per square foot was higher. And so what we can take away from that is that in these neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted by eviction filings in Boston, that we're also seeing that the renters most at risk of facing an eviction filing are those who live in a property where the landlord's absentee, where the construction is newer or it's a more recently renovated building, and the property value is higher. So now I want to turn it back to Lisa to talk a little bit about the context of this and some of the policy solutions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David, for explaining the key findings of this report. I'm going to talk briefly now about how we arrived here. Could you advance the slide? Thank you. So well before the COVID-19 crisis, as we've been hearing, Black communities and other communities of color were subject to systemic racism in the form of government policies and discriminatory and oftentimes violent actions of private market actors. So we're talking about things like racially restrictive covenants, redlining, white flight and blockbusting, housing discrimination, urban renewal, arson, predatory lending, foreclosure, just to name a few. These public policies and private actions had the effect of siphoning wealth out of Black communities and into white middle-class communities in the surrounding suburbs. The compounding of generations of intentional disinvestment, violence, and predatory lending in Black and other communities of color created extreme inequality, poverty, and ultimately the neighborhoods that are today characterized by disproportionate levels of eviction and forced moves. And at the same time, it's important to highlight the movements of resistance against oppression that Black communities and other communities of color led all along the way. Our report puts a spotlight on community-led struggles that fought back and won significant demands in every decade. And if it were not for the sustained community organizing against displacement, one could argue that the city of Boston might not be a majority people of color city that it is today. So now that we're in the COVID crisis, we can see how this global pandemic acted as an accelerator. It exposed the fault lines in our market-driven housing system. Communities that were already struggling to make ends meet now have to deal with the prospect of loss of income, severe illness, and increased caretaking responsibilities. We see more clearly than ever that the housing market as it currently operates was never meant to ensure that all people have safe, quality, and affordable housing. Instead, this crisis is creating the conditions that will usher in a tidal wave of evictions. Massachusetts Housing Court is estimating 20,000 eviction filings immediately after the moratorium on foreclosures and evictions is lifted, as early as August 18th. We expect that this will be catastrophic for Black communities, for immigrant communities, and for other working class communities of color. Next slide, please. Luckily, we are not powerless. We have seen in our state that we have the ability to act quickly to enact policy that responds to this unprecedented crisis. So as an example, through the power of organizing, the Massachusetts Homes for All Coalition that City Life is a member of, and many allies across the state, in just 5 weeks, were able to pass the eviction and foreclosure moratorium, and which is aptly named the strongest piece of housing legislation the state had passed in at least a decade. At least we believe this at City Life, that this is the strongest piece of housing legislation that our state has seen in a very long time. We've shown that we can pass bold tenant and homeowner protections, and now we must act even more quickly if we're going to prepare for this tidal wave of evictions and foreclosures. What we must do is pass 2 vitally important pieces of legislation right now. The first, an act to guarantee housing stability for COVID-19 emergency and recovery. And the second, we need to pass the Tenant Protection Act. So the act to guarantee housing stability will provide immediate relief and 1 year of housing stability for renters and working class owners who face eviction and foreclosure because of the accumulated debt that they've accrued from COVID-related hardship during the past few months. And we invite everyone to join us on Thursday at a press conference where State Representatives Kevin Honan and Mike Connolly will be joined by Massachusetts Homes for All Coalition members to announce the filing of this bill. And you can see City Life's Facebook page for more information about this. And then the second policy that I'll end with, the Tenant Protection Act, will provide long-term housing stability for working class renters. This bill will lift the ban on rent control in our state and give all municipalities the option to choose the anti-displacement measures like rent control and like just cause eviction that their localities need to achieve long-term housing stability for all working class people. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Annie and Ruby, who will speak about their experiences fighting eviction before the moratorium was passed. They'll talk about what they think will happen to their families and their building if the state doesn't enact strong protections for tenants after the moratorium is lifted. And so I'm gonna pass it over to Annie first, and then after Annie speaks, we'll hear from Ruby. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annie Gordon. I'm a tenant association leader at the Somalia Apartments in Mattapan, where I've lived for 44 years. I'm a market rate tenant, and in 2019, I was hit with a high rent increase of $260 $65. And this really put me in a state of panic and anxiety because I have nowhere to go and I don't know where this increase is going to come from. And also because our homes are our basis of is the basis of our life. This is where we recharge and we come together, recharge and connect with our families. But in communities of color and my community, we are not valued. These communities where the residents are only able to meet the necessities of life, that we get the extremely high rent increases. And they don't understand, and when the residents don't understand that they have rights and that they can stand up and fight back, that leads to evictions and high numbers of homelessness. But with the help of City Life Vida Urbana, we learned in my community that we have rights and that we as tenants could form a tenants association and fight to stay in our homes. We are fighting to stay in our homes. And I would just like to say thanks to City Life for working and fighting with us and to help us eliminate this systemic problem. We also would urge our state legislators to help us by passing the Tenants Protection Act and rent control. And I want to thank you for listening to me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruby James Osser, and I'm with City Life in Massachusetts, Boston, with City Life Vida Urbana. And I was struggling to stay in my home also. When I moved at 22 Rexford Street, my previous landlord sold the building to a new owner. And after he sold the building in May. And in August, that's for 2 months after my husband had passed away, the new landlord wanted to go up $700 increase on our rent by December of 2018. And before I agreed to a $700 increase. Now, this man never met anyone in the building, but he wanted a $700 increase on the rent, knowing that none of us here could afford to pay a $700 increase. So City Life Vida Urbana, I went and continued the meetings. The landlord did not want to do negotiations at all. So we did a strategy, we did a protest in front of his house. And after the protest, the next day, he called for some type of negotiation. So after the protest, he wanted to negotiate. So we went to court, and the judge sent us to negotiation. It took us all day to reach an agreement of some kind. But before we left the courthouse that day, I had a 3-year lease with a 3% increase each year. So this could have been avoided if he wanted to be a person to sit down and negotiate and not just want to put people out of their home. If you put a person out of their home, where are they going? They have no place to go. You got to give them time. He didn't want to do any negotiation for us to do the research in order to find a place to go. So you just can't come and expect people to leave when they don't have a place to go. We don't live to pay rent. So right now we are in the process of living or working to pay rent. If we had rent control established, that would give us some sort of resources that we wouldn't have to pay all of our money into rent. Right now, my entire income will go towards rent, but I just don't live to just put a roof over my head. We need a roof over your head, but you need to pay the light bill, the gas bill. You need to do other things. You need to have a car, you got to pay insurance, all kind of stuff. You just can't live to pay rent in this country. So if we don't have rent control to come back, we'll be in a world of trouble. And I want to thank City Life for taking the time to let me speak to you guys today. But if we don't do something before this moratorium is over, we will be in a world of panic with people not being able to live in their home. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to Ms. Annie and Ruby from City Life Vida Urbana. We do not live just to pay rent. I think that is a good key takeaway to remember when we're having all of these conversations, and to also continue to discuss and debate with people what the logic is behind evictions and how that actually is not addressing the root of the problem. The root of the problem is not just not being able to pay rent. The root of the problem is not just that landlords can't make money off of this space right now. The root of the problem is our communities need healthy, safe, thriving spaces to live. And we need to think about how we're doing that, not just how people who own buildings make money. So with that, are there any final thoughts from City Life Vida Urbana? Or we're closing out with the members. We're feeling solid? Yes, wrapping it up, putting a bow on it. Okay. I wanted to make sure that folks knew who were asking questions in the chat. We'll be sending out this recording. We'll be sending out links to the report. We'll be sending out all of the resources that are mentioned. We'll be sending out the slides, and we'll be sending out what's in the chat box. So keep plugging in information, keep plugging in questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the Q&A. And for the ones that we can't get to, we'll try to provide some follow-up information as well. And thank you again to Ms. Ruby and Ms. Annie and everyone at City Life Vida Urbana and David at MIT for breaking down some really important information that's going to help us to also think about what these things look like in the cities where we live. And so I'm going to transition over to hearing from some of the other member groups at Right to the City Alliance. We're going to be starting off with Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative with Breon, based in New Orleans. And then we'll be moving on to Housing Justice League in Atlanta with Allison. And after that, we'll wrap it up with Jarima in Austin with Basta. So Breon, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, everybody. I just want to give thanks to Right to the City for hosting this, for City Life Vida Urbana for producing this amazing report, and for your members for talking about what they're facing right now in this moment. I know it can be really hard to talk publicly about these things, so thank you for sharing your stories. My name is Breon Dedecker. I am the program manager down at Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative. We are a 12-year-old community land trust and housing rights organization based in New Orleans. We were founded after Hurricane Katrina in an attempt to do a grassroots bottom-up recovery plan for our neighborhood that had been heavily damaged and decimated by the floodwaters. We build permanently affordable housing for low and moderate income residents. We do tenant organizing to expand tenant rights in the city. And we also produce original research on how the housing crisis is impacting various communities in New Orleans. And we've done extensive work around evictions over the past couple of years, including releasing the first report analyzing evictions in New Orleans just last year. We went through a very similar process to what City Life did, where we did court records requests, public records requests, which then we matched to census block data in New Orleans to reveal the hidden geography of the evictions crisis in New Orleans. And you can advance slide. We did this report in partnership with Professor Davida Finger at Loyola University College of Law here in New Orleans. We did 3 years worth of court data. The reason why it was limited to 3 years is because the New Orleans court system didn't really have a functioning computer system for much of the time prior to that. So the records were very difficult to access going back any further. What we realized when we did this analysis is that the eviction crisis in New Orleans is far and away much worse than the national average. In 2017, 1 out of every 19 renter households in New Orleans faced a court-ordered eviction in 2017. Again, that's just court-ordered eviction. That does not count any evictions that were informal, where the landlord just locks you out, throws your belongings out. Our overall eviction rate was 5.2%. So 5.2% of all renter households received a court order eviction in 2017. And the most affected neighborhood in New Orleans was experiencing an eviction rate of 10.4%. And that is in a neighborhood in New Orleans East called Little Woods that we'll be talking more about in a little bit. We found that eviction rates were highest in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, with 1 in 4 households receiving an eviction judgment between 2015 and 2017 in census blocks where it was more than 90% Black or African American. And those census block groups only make up 29% of the city. So you're talking about 29% of the city experiencing 51% of all of the court-ordered evictions in New Orleans. And one thing that we realized that we think is really important to really talk about in New Orleans, in the context of New Orleans, is that evictions were occurring at higher rates in neighborhoods that are, quote, affordable. So some of the highest eviction rates in the city are in communities that have some of the lowest rents in the city. And that really speaks to the fact that even rents that are supposedly affordable in the city of New Orleans are far, far too much for the average New Orleanian renter to be able to afford. So folks, again, are very, very vulnerable, where even the slightest economic unexpected cost puts them at risk of housing insecurity, puts them at risk of eviction. So long before the pandemic struck, we already had this massive, massive eviction crisis in the city, and we had tens of thousands of residents who were very vulnerable to eviction and displacement. And you can go to the next slide. And this is what the map looks like. And so you can see in New Orleans East, where there's a high concentration of supposedly affordable rentals, we're seeing extremely high eviction rates. Also in the center core of the city, which are communities that were historically redlined and denied access to mortgages, denied access to fair housing opportunities, those neighborhoods are also experiencing high eviction rates. So we're seeing this legacy of exclusion carrying on through the ages that is now turning into this legacy of evictions that are plaguing certain members of our community, particularly Black neighborhoods. And you can go to the next slide. Advancing. Did it get frozen? Am I frozen? Ooh, ooh, ah. Here we go, next. Okay. So we did a whole bunch of neighborhood profiles in our report, and the one that I really wanted to pull out to show about how all of these different crises are impacting specific communities in New Orleans is Little Woods in New Orleans, which is the neighborhood that we found had the highest eviction rates in the city. Again, it's 10.4%. We estimated that around 4,500 people had been displaced by eviction over that period of this study. And how we did that was by estimating average family size in that community using, again, census block data. Little Woods is a neighborhood that is 96% Black. And I think it's important to point out that it had a very high employment rate. So many people were reported working for income during this time period of this study. 92% of people were working for income. But again, because New Orleans is a city that relies very heavily on tourism, very heavily on low wage work, we have a very low median income in a lot of our communities. So the median household income in Little Woods was $29,000. And that really reflects, again, New Orleans is a city that hasn't been able to raise our minimum wage. We're stuck at the federal minimum wage level. So we have a high number of folks working for $7.25 an hour, particularly in the service industry and the tourism industry. And so again, when you have such low incomes, people are just already facing a lot of dire sort of calculations when it comes to figuring out what bills they're going to pay, figuring out how to pay for child's school uniforms, how to pay for any healthcare costs. People are really living on this razor edge. And you can go to the next slide. And this again shows the rent burdens that existed in New Orleans prior to the pandemic even starting. And you can see the rent burden map looks really similar to the evictions map. New Orleans is a city of renters. 55% of the city rents instead of owns their homes. 3 out of every 5 renters in New Orleans pay 30% of their income in rent. And 2 out of 5 renters pay more than 50% of their income in rent. So we have very, very high cost burdens when it comes to rent in New Orleans. We were recently rated as the 2nd least affordable city in the nation for renters. 4 out of 5 rent burden households are Black. So again, you can see this legacy of discrimination in the economy, discrimination in the housing market, sort of culminating in seeing a concentration of risk at eviction within our Black community here. Black women in Louisiana actually face the largest wage and gender gap in the country, making only 47 cents to every dollar that a white man earns. And right now, the estimated unemployment rate in New Orleans is 25%, which is significantly higher than the estimated unemployment rate nationally. And again, that's a reflection of the fact that our economy is really driven by tourism, and tourism was one of the first things to shut down, and it's probably going to be one of the last things to come back. So we think we are in for a very, very long economic downturn. New Orleans, the metro region, was rated as one of the top 10 most vulnerable cities to a prolonged economic recession due to the coronavirus pandemic. So this is something we are going to be living through for a long time down here in New Orleans. You can go to the next slide. Following our eviction report last year, we really wanted to do more research on evictions in the city, precisely because there's only so much you can learn from court records. You don't get a lot of demographic information. You certainly don't get any conversation that's occurring in court, anything that the tenant is saying, anything that the landlord is saying. There was just a lot of unanswered questions that we had around who is getting evicted and why in New Orleans. So in September 2019, we launched an eviction court monitoring project where we trained volunteers to go into court to keep track of evictions and start sort of writing down some of this more qualitative and assembling more quantitative data on evictions in New Orleans. We were active from September 2019 until March 2020. I was actually in court training new volunteers the day before they shut down court for the pandemic. So we were up there right until the end, right? We saw some of the last cases that got evicted right before they shut down court. We observed 671 cases at that time, which is roughly a third of all cases hurled in court during that 6-month period. And of these 671 cases, 62.3% of all cases ended in eviction. And that represents 418 households, 345 of which were given 24 hours to vacate their homes. One thing that I really want to stress is that the eviction process in New Orleans is very, very fast. People can be evicted in as little as 5 to 7 days after receiving notice that they have a court date. This is partially because our landlord-tenant laws have not been updated since the 1880s. So we're dealing with some very antiquated laws. And we've been preempted at the state level from passing a lot of more progressive laws at our city level. And so we're dealing with very old laws that strongly favor the landlords and means that people have very little time when they get that notice to mount any sort of defense. And that is something that we are very concerned about. We found in our court monitoring report that tenants who did not have legal representation were 450% more likely to be evicted than tenants with legal representation. Which really shows that cities need to be investing in right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And then we did see precisely what we had inferred from our previous study, which is that the vast majority of people going through eviction court in New Orleans are Black residents. New Orleans is a city that is 59% Black, but 82.2% of all cases that we witnessed had Black tenants. And then 56.8% of all tenants in eviction court were Black women. And so that, again, is a reflection of how all of these systemic oppressions that exist in our housing market, in our jobs market, really put the highest amount of pain on Black women in particular in New Orleans. You can advance screen. And it should come with no surprise that the pandemic is also impacting these communities the hardest. So we know that all of these underlying systemic inequalities in New Orleans ensures that a disproportionate number of Black households will be evicted if courts reopen. This map is from the City of New Orleans' own COVID-19 caseload dashboard. And the same communities with the high eviction rates are the same communities that we see with active COVID-19 infection rates. And we know that in New Orleans, Black residents are falling ill with COVID-19 and they're experiencing higher rates of mortality. So not only are Black residents more likely to get evicted, but they are more likely to get ill from COVID-19. So we're seeing a moment where particularly our state representatives, our state leadership, seemingly are ignoring this data, precisely showing that the communities that are most at risk of one thing are most at risk of eviction are also most at risk from this pandemic, and yet they are still moving forward with eviction court opening. It actually opened today. And Littlewoods, the neighborhood that we spotlighted with the 10.4% eviction rate, it does have the highest rate of COVID-19 infection in the city. And again, it's how all of these different vulnerabilities are laying on top of one another in New Orleans. You can just predict exactly how this is gonna go. And you can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned briefly a second ago, eviction courts in New Orleans did open today. They processed the first cases. Most of them were filed before the pandemic, but new cases are moving forward tomorrow. We already know from court monitoring that there are cases that are supposedly covered by the CARES Act that have been filed. So there will be the first stress test on whether or not the judges here actually are paying attention to the CARES Act legislation. We will have monitors going into court tomorrow. So we will know how these things are starting to shake out. Jane Place as an organization, we do have a membership base that is organizing mutual aid support for tenants right now and trying to organize eviction defense. So we're working on that with our membership. We also just released this comic book, which is a step-by-step guide to the eviction process in New Orleans for tenants. It goes through like how to communicate with your landlord, how to collect evidence, what you can expect in court, what questions you should be prepared to answer, what possible legal defenses you might have. So that's one thing that we just released in order to try and get people some resources in their hands to try and prevent their eviction and their displacement. Yeah, and that is pretty much it. And then we are trying to monitor evictions across the city. And again, advocating and pushing for trying to keep courts closed. We did get city council to support a resolution to keep eviction court closed through the summer. But again, this is a situation that the state has a lot of the power here. And that's just a really heavy lift in Louisiana. And that pretty much wraps it up for me. Thank you again, everyone, for having us. And thank you, City Life, for your amazing report. It's beautiful.
Thank you, Breon. So next we are going to transition over to Allison from Housing Justice League in Atlanta to talk about their work, how they see evictions happening in the city of Atlanta, and hear more about some of the work that they're doing to push back. Allison, I'll hand it over to you. Allison, you need to unmute.
Yes. Hi, y'all. Thanks for having us on today. We're excited to be here and to hear from other organizations who are facing some of the similar issues that we're facing down here in the South. particularly in Atlanta. So first, I just want to give like a brief background of Housing Justice League. So we are a community-led organization that's made up of long-term residents, community stakeholders, owners, and renters. We also are an organization that believes that housing is a human right, regardless of race, national or ethnic origin, economic background, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender, or immigration status. We always wanted to say that to talk about how important that is for people to recognize that this is not just a unilateral fight, that this is something that we are all having to put our hands in to fight. And I also want to say, like, just for that reason, Housing Justice League, for those many reasons, we work to really build collective community power. And we actually are an organization that believes that if we can all work together and when we work together, we will win all of our campaigns that we are fighting. And we do some of these fights by working in partnership with our tenant associations. So we work and we help strengthen with tenants associations to bring about or build their collective power. And we also work through issue-based campaigns. We confront struggles that threaten the well-being of rights of community members and also those institutions that support organizations like Housing Justice League. So I just wanted to really give you just a brief overview of what HJL is. So before I get started, I just do want to really acknowledge that while we are doing work around eviction and while we do acknowledge that there is not just a housing crisis, there's also an organizing crisis. And I want to make sure that we are uplifting that. And we do want to talk about and uplift the violence that comes along with that and how long communities like ours have been violated against for so many years and decades. And I also want to say that this crisis has not just begun. We have been enduring this type of violence and pain since Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, then we faced it again through redlining. And then we face it again through the names and titles of urban development projects. And I also want to talk about how urban development projects really infuse the system or the systemic way of displacing people, not just through means of moving brick and mortar, by ways of evicting and evictions and what evicted really means to us. So in Atlanta, and I did not submit my slides yet. I was so busy and I do apologize, but I do have slides. So if people want those, I can send them over to you, Matt. And if you wouldn't mind just putting them in the chat box so people can really view these slides. So in Atlanta, the vast majority of our people that are being evicted are really being evicted. Some of them are being evicted to non-payments of rents. And we all know that is because Atlanta has become or is this place where it does cater to business and business elite and does not really take care of the people who are existing in Atlanta and making sure that we have livable wages and people have really great housing to live in. And so also we see that majority of these people that are being evicted are Black and at a high poverty rates. We also have an issue with serial filings in our city, which means that we have many owners that have many different properties, and what they do is continue to file people to collect administrative fees. In Atlanta, we have in our court system, as of March 30, 2020, Atlanta sees over 1,000 evictions filings a week. Last year, through our magistrate court, it was known that people who are property owners had filed over 65 evictions in 65,000 evictions in 1 year. So yes, we do have a problem, and it's very, very challenging to deal with these issues in Atlanta. One other thing that we also know is that 53% of the tenants do not file an answer. and many more do not even file a proper legal defense. And that is because the eviction process is a very negative, convoluted way to be displaced out of your home. What we found in terms of organizing with different tenants and different people who are going through this process is that they have no clue of what this eviction process is. So we try to really work with tenants to do a lot of training around evictions, making sure that people can understand the legal jargon, making sure that people have resources and are connected to those folks who are in the legal realm, so people who are providing legal services, making sure that we have a connection to them, and that and people who come to us or people who are a part of our organization really have someone who's willing to support them through this process. So one other thing is what we've done in Atlanta, particularly with Housing Justice League around the eviction, is that we created our own eviction manual, much something like the ones in New Orleans. It's not a comic. Now, it does have really interesting art to go with it, but we find it to be a very simple way and a very simple process to walk people through this process. Oftentimes people just don't know how to navigate through these types of process, especially if this is their first time going through such an event. So this manual that we created, we want it not just to have a manual that people can follow. We also want this to be a really tool that is teachable to other folks. So once someone in a community, an apartment community, has learned it and has figured it out, we want them to host and hold their own trainings around the evictions. The other thing that we make sure that we are working with in terms of eviction is that we've put out our own set of demands to the Chief Magistrate Court, who follows us on Facebook, Instagram, and everywhere else, and is quickly to correct us if there's information that we're putting out that's wrong. So in order for us to really have concrete policy changes, it's not that we are submissive or submitting ourselves over to the judicial system, is that we really want concrete changes. We want policies that really support people who have experience and who have very negative experiences with the court to really be able to balance and reverse the way that the tenants and landlords relationship and how that was created and how that needs to be dismantled. So while it is important for us to also make sure that we stay in connection and create a relationship, it's also really, really more important for us to make sure we're organizing tenants so they are well prepared and well armed to fight this system of unjust evictions. What we are seeing in Atlanta is that these huge development projects, these projects like the Beltline, the projects like the Gulch, the projects like the redevelopment, and all of these other projects that have, well, let me also just say these educational institutions that also create and infuses displacement in the city of Atlanta. What we have seen in Atlanta is that these pockets of communities that were affordable units are no longer affordable. These urban development projects have been introduced into a city and into an environment where they are supposed to be prosperous and helping the community build itself up by the bootstraps. In all actuality, it has been a mechanism and a driving engine of gentrification and displacement in Atlanta. So what we are doing in terms of the eviction process, we are literally canvassing, well, before COVID, we were literally canvassing communities, knocking on doors, asking people about the eviction process, making sure that they were well equipped, asking them, have they ever been through an eviction before? Have any of their neighbors ever experienced an eviction, and what that process was like? So in all of this galvanizing and trying to organize, urban development projects don't stop. But what we do have as a tool for us is a very well organized tenant association and tenant associations partnerships all throughout the city of Atlanta that have come in Housing Justice League seeking some type of support to this issue. So what we know today is that with COVID-19 and this pandemic that has really hit our communities, and much like all of the data that has been shared by Breon from James Place in Louisiana, is that we know that these evictions are very much mirrored to the people who have a very high concentrated, what do I want to say, a very high concentrated who have been diagnosed with COVID-19. And most of these people are our frontline and essential workers as well. And we have tried to create a hotline, a COVID-19 hotline that our volunteers and our organization members can help respond to folks who are calling in and are wanting some type of support in terms of where can they find resources to help them pay their rents? Where can they find resources to help them file or fill out their unemployment? Where can they find resources to make sure that their landlords are not doing self-help evictions and they're not going through unjust evictions? So we have these people who are maintaining these hotlines to really ensure that people during this time are not going to be unjustly evicted from their homes. And while we're doing that at the same time, we are very much bracing ourselves for the eviction court to reopen. And while that is going to happen in Atlanta on June 7th, we have people that are prepared to stand outside of the courthouse with their mask and their gloves, social distancing, but also looking for people who are coming in to file their answers where they will have help in doing so. Right now, Atlanta is not allowing people into their courtrooms. If you do not have a case or you are not on the court calendar, you are not allowed to be in the courtroom. So we are going to try to capture people on the outside of the courthouse, also on our public transit. We are going to have people on public transit who those bus routes that are taking folks into downtown Atlanta. We want to try to capture people wherever they are. So I'm going to leave it right there.
Thanks, Allison. I'm gonna hand it over to Jarimar from BASTA so we can hear from our last presenter and then get to some of the Q&A, and I'll get the slides queued up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone, for being here. My name is Jarimar, and I'm a tenant organizer with BASTA, Building and Strengthening Tenant Action in Austin, Texas. BASTA supports Austin renters in working together to improve conditions in their homes and their communities. Housing justice and tenant justice is racial justice. While 55% of all Austinite households are renters, we see a much larger rate for people of color. 71% of Black Austinite households and 65% of Latinx Austinite households are renters. In recent years, Austin was one of the only major US cities that has actually seen a decrease in its Black population. Preventing evictions is a key part of preventing further displacement of Austin's communities of color. As City Life and others on this call can tell you, it's hard to get good data on evictions and almost impossible to get demographic breakdowns on those evictions. We were able to run some numbers based on zip codes of eviction filings in the past few years and demographics in those zip codes. If you go to the next slide, what we saw was that in Austin zip codes with a higher Black population, it was more likely that a renter would have an eviction filed against them. Next slide. This correlation was true to a lesser extent for the Latinx zip codes in Austin. Of the 10 zip codes with the most eviction filings, 9 of them were majority people of color. Of the 10 zip codes with the fewest eviction filings, 8 of those were majority white. Next slide, please. These disparities and the trauma experienced by those facing eviction prompted BASTA, the DSA Austin chapter, and other organizations to come together last fall to form the Eviction Solidarity Network, or ESN. We envision a city where the power dynamic between landlords and tenants is shifted so that tenants have the time, resources, knowledge, and rights to have autonomy and control over their homes, to prevent evictions in pursuit of housing justice. Our plan was to show up at courts in solidarity with renters, so judges knew we were watching and tenants knew that community members stood by their side and that the injustice they were experiencing was not an individual problem, but rather a product of systemic inequities. Next slide, please. And then COVID-19 happened. We are on the cusp of a second public health crisis that is entirely human-made and entirely preventable. So ESN kicked into high gear and we have launched the Eviction is Not a Cure campaign to keep our eviction curve flat. You can see here that the eviction filings increased steadily in 2020, but then leveled off on March 13th after our local courts issued a moratorium or a pause on evictions. We want to keep it that way. Next slide, please. The folks most at risk of eviction are people of color. Our construction workers, service industry workers, grocery workers, and healthcare workers are all also vulnerable to COVID-19. This is a little bit about what we've done, and the campaign is still evolving. Next slide, please. We've used social media to create awareness of the magnitude of this public health crisis. We've created Facebook frames and Zoom backgrounds to use along with beautiful shareable art. Next slide. We've created an eviction solidarity dashboard to aggregate and share vital eviction related data. This dashboard was designed to look like our Austin COVID-19 dashboard. We partnered with Open Austin, who helped us develop a web scraper to get the data. Next slide. We have organized over 70 volunteers to witness and track virtual court proceedings. This is a screenshot of us showing up virtually to eviction proceedings with our Zoom backgrounds before they were limited to YouTube streaming. And this was in the 2 or 3 weeks that the courts reopened until we had another moratorium or pause. Lastly, we're organizing a group of volunteers to provide resources and information directly to tenants. Next slide, please. A little bit about what we have seen in the courts after training some volunteers to track data in the court proceedings. 2.5, and yeah, just as a side note, 2.5 weeks into the eviction hearings, a moratorium was reimposed. And during those 2 weeks, we saw dozens of households evicted, including a family with active COVID-19. Thanks to the observations of our volunteers, we noted some big issues. One of them was that the digital divide was on full display. And this is referring to tenants not being able to access the court proceedings because not having internet, not having computers, or understanding how to use Zoom. Tenants struggle to share evidence to the judges through Zoom, especially if they had evidence on their phone or tried to show a paper on the screen. Another issue was language justice. Little, if no effort was given to providing translation services for tenants at the hearings. They had to rely on a family member or a friend. In one case, we saw in the case with a family with active COVID-19, a teenage daughter was the one that actually was translating everything for her father, and they were evicted. So while we have this pause, we and Austin tenants have a moment to breathe, and we're using this time to develop a rapid response team and have everything set up and ready to go for the next wave of evictions. It's amazing to hear and be inspired by other grassroots groups doing this work, and we look forward to collaborating to keep the eviction curve flat across this country, because eviction is not a cure. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have heard a lot from many folks across the country who are struggling to address the massive threat of evictions that are happening all across the country. We've heard from member leaders who are throwing down not just for themselves, but for their neighbors, for their families, for their communities as a whole. And now we want to dig into at least a couple of questions before we wrap up. And I think we have some of them pulled from the registration and from the chat. So I'm going to put out 3 questions, and then I'll open it up to panelists to answer them as y'all see fit, just for the sake of time. So the first question is, what resources are available if people are experiencing illegal or self-help evictions? The next question is, what rights do tenants and landlords have when COVID is a mitigating factor? And then maybe like lifting up again some of the key takeaways or key points that y'all already named around solutions to ease the massive wave of evictions after these moratoriums and tenant protections are lifted. And we'll open it up to see who wants to respond to any of those.
So I'll just, on the resources question, I'll say that for folks who are afraid of losing your home because you are afraid that you're either going to experience an illegal eviction, because most evictions are illegal during the pause, or because you're accumulating a bunch of debt and you don't know what's going to happen after the moratorium, and you're in the greater Boston area, I encourage you to call our emergency eviction hotline. So you can go onto our website to get that number. Our website is clvu.org, and you can find lots of resources there.
Likewise, in Atlanta, our hotline is statewide. So if you are experiencing any of these, we have folks on the ground that are ready to support you. So you can also find a lot of that information on our webpage, www.housingjustice.league.org, under COVID-19 response or hotline.
We also have in Boston, austin.org, COVID/19, and I'm sharing that in the chat. And that includes a letter that you can send to your landlord. First, requesting to know if that property is covered under CARES Act protections, whether or not that property receives Fannie and Freddie mortgage backing. And then the other letter is also a letter basically requesting for more time, or trying to figure out a way to make a payment plan if you can't pay rent right away.
Very similarly, we have a list that is on Google Drive where you can look up your apartment to see if you are covered by the CARES Act. We've publicized that in various Facebook groups. We're having twice a week organizing calls right now to get folks connected to our tenant organizing and to the movement to try to build the type of community power that is necessary in order to interrupt this process. With evictions going ahead and starting in New Orleans, we've now sort of like hit the sort of crisis moment where we need to figure out how to intervene. And so we're doing that in collaboration with our members. And that's sort of like where we are right now. And I think for long-term solutions, we need to be investing in community-controlled housing. We need to be building permanently affordable housing. We need to be expanding rent control and tenant rights. Really, the only thing that can protect us in these moments are rights that we have in order to stay rooted in place. And that's why in New Orleans, we're especially terrified because we are one of the states with some of the worst landlord renter protections in the nation. And so I'm trying to be optimistic and thinking that in this moment of great upheaval, there's a window opening to pass things particularly at our state level that, a year ago, we've tried 3 years in a row to pass better landlord tenant laws, and we've gone down 3 years in a row. And we're really hopeful that moving forward in this moment of crisis, that the window of opportunity is opening to pass better laws and to redirect investment into community controlled housing so folks aren't getting displaced. So that's my trying to be optimistic like moment.
We can't hear you, Kamal.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. So there were a few questions that came up around what are some of the ways that lawyers can support organizers, and are there attorneys working on eviction and housing issues that are collectively organized or coming together to do this work? Because we know it definitely looks different from state to state, even from city to city or municipality. And I'll see if Pam can speak on that a little bit first, and then the rest of the panelists as well.
Thanks, Kamau. So there's a way that we're beginning to coordinate and get organized between lawyers and organizers across the country. And so Right to the City has partnered with the Movement Law Lab to bring housing justice organizers as well as housing justice lawyers into the same space. One of the first things we're doing is just creating a volunteer database, which I'm going to link in the chat. So feel free, if you're interested, if you know anybody else who's interested, to volunteer. You don't necessarily have to be a lawyer. If you're a paralegal or have comfort, some of the work that some of our organizers were talking about, being in courts, if you're familiar with that process, please fill this out. But also we're looking for lawyers as well. So the process of signing up is really to begin to develop that database across the country and then begin to match lawyers or folks who can provide some of that support to organizers working on the ground with families or with individuals who are facing eviction. So that's where we're starting, and we're hoping to build out and again, build with each other to ensure that there is a synergy between what's really needed in the community and also what lawyers and the legal framework can help do.
I would just say that that infrastructure that Right to the City is building nationally, we have been and we are continuing to build at the state level. So Massachusetts Homes for All Coalition has a number of really great movement lawyers from Mass Law Reform Institute, Greater Boston Legal Services, Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, the Legal Service Center, and then lots and lots of law students and independent lawyers who are just movement folks. So if you're in Massachusetts, definitely connect with Massachusetts Homes for All Coalition, housingguarantee.org to get connected.
Yeah, so in Atlanta, one way that our legal resources has been so helpful is being able to really help us understand all of the legal jargon that's coming down from the courts, from the higher courts. There were times when we didn't understand, when the courts were reopening. We didn't understand the times and dates that the people could go back and file their answers, and all of it was just written in all legal terms. And they have really stepped up to the plate where we could all understand, what was happening. And that way it really helped us convert our message out to folks a little simpler so they can understand what was really happening before the courts reopened. So they have been very supportive in that way.
Thanks, y'all. So I think we, unfortunately, because of all the brilliance and information and hard work on the ground that y'all are plugging into, we didn't have enough time to do as much of the questions and answers as we wanted to. So what I wanted to lift up around next steps are that we are going to be pulling all of these questions from the chat. We will be sharing out community organization resources, links to everybody who spoke. We will be getting the chat, the audio recording, and the slides all translated into Spanish by the end of the week to share out with folks. And we will also be snatching those slides from Allison at Housing Justice League to plug them in and make sure y'all get access to those too. I think maybe, let's see. Maybe, I know there are a lot more questions that y'all have, so if you do have them, please put them into the chat now. so that we can kind of pull out some of the ones that have similar themes and think about how we can do some of that follow-up. If there are press that are interested in doing interviews or follow-up with any of the member organizations, you can reach out to Matt at righttothecity.org, and he can connect you with any of the brilliant speakers who have been here on this call. I want to thank everybody for getting on and name the urgency and importance of this moment right now. I think it's really important that we see the work around evictions not just as an explicit housing issue, but also as a racial justice issue, as a community control issue, as an issue of self-determination, as a core piece of what we need to challenge how the world has been set up and how we've prioritized profit over people a lot of the time, really consistently, which has shown like some very concrete impacts on folks all across the country. I think even in thinking about the calls to defund police, we heard from folks at Inquilinos Unidos in Minneapolis that they are naming very concretely that a world without police is a world without evictions. And we have seen the ways that policing and law enforcement have been used to displace folks from their homes and communities, to maintain homes and housing as a tool for profit and extraction, and not as a tool for community safety, not as a tool for stability. And we're really trying to transform that, not just in this moment, but in the long term. So we're working to protect people from mass evictions in this moment, and we're working to build alternative forms of housing in the long term. None of these organizations have gotten started in the past year. People have been throwing down for a long, long time in their communities where they're at. And I want to encourage all of you to check out their organizations, check out their websites, read the resources, and share the information and have some real conversations with people where you live. If you're interested in connecting with folks, please do check out the follow-up email. We'll be sending out all of the English materials today, and we'll be sending out all of the Spanish materials by the end of the week. Our apologies for not having live interpretation. There were some last-minute issues, but we know it's important that Spanish-speaking folks have access to this information as well. Again, thank you, everyone, for getting on, and we'll send follow-up information and opportunities to connect and contact with the speakers right after this call. And with that, we're going to wrap it up and put a bow on it so y'all can go back to doing the powerful and important work that you do. Thanks, everybody.